The concept comes into being in 1918, perhaps appropriately enough, thanks to a South African's insight and suggestion, and that was Smuts' report. A lot of the potential personnel for a South African Air Force had been created through the efforts of Alistair Miller recruiting men for the Royal Flying Corps and then the Royal Air Force, as well as those men who had served and who'd served in the South African Aviation Corps earlier on, which of course then became 26 Squadron RFC. So by the end of 1918, one could say that you have two prerequisites met. The one is the concept of an Air Force, and the other one is a lot of potential personnel. What remains for the creation of an Air Force would be that you'd have to appoint the head of an Air Force, you would have to find the equipment for an Air Force, and you'd have to find a place to have your initial base or bases, depending on how large it was going to be. So the problem of potential equipment for the Air Force was solved very easily in the middle of 1919, the year after the war ends. The war ends in November of 1918. And by the middle of the following year, Britain was already starting to consider what it was going to do with all of the aircraft which it had amassed to fight in the closing stages of the war. And Britain had by far the largest air arm by the time we get to 1918. So not only was the Royal Air Force the largest air force, not only was it the first Air Force, but it was also the largest Air Force at the conclusion of hostilities. And that presented a problem at that point, because what were they now going to do with these aircraft now that peace had returned? So Britain then offers each of its dominions, each of the four dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, 100 aircraft each, if they wanted them, as the starting point for an air wing. The only country that accepted the full package deal, in other words, all 100 aircraft, was South Africa. It was probably pretty obvious that Jan Smuts, having come up with the concept of an Air Force, having foreseen the usefulness that it would present for South Africa, and having realized that 100 aircraft was a valuable gift, then chose to accept what became known as the imperial gift in its entirety. None of the other three dominions did. They accepted smaller packages, not anticipating that they were going to use that many, or not really anticipating an air force in the foreseeable future. And in fact, some of the dominions that did accept aircraft handed them on or passed them on to civilian operators. But in the case of South Africa, all 100 were accepted. And that meant that South Africa had the makings of an air force. And Smuts then immediately chose a man who'd been serving in the Royal Air Force by the end of the war, whose South African rank was Lieutenant Colonel, and that was Pierre van Ryneveld, who distinguished himself as a pilot during the war, having been awarded a Distinguished Service Order and a Military Cross during the course of his flying. He was, in 1919, he was part of the RAF in occupied Germany in the Rhineland area, supervising the Treaty of Versailles, while really supervising the armistice that had been signed at the end of 1918. And van Ryneveld was then asked by Smuts to select 100 aircraft and to supervise the packaging and shipping of these to South Africa. And South African servicemen who were being discharged in Britain were then taken on to undertake that task. It's worthwhile just putting what seems like to put in context the problem that Britain faced when the war came to end. Those photos of aircraft awaiting disposal gives you some inkling. But sorry, I don't know what's... Something's causing a problem here. I've got a menu bar sitting on the top of my screen here, Calder. You know what that is? Okay, let's moved up. Okay, there we go.
See,
All right. So
okay.
Britain's problem at the end of the First World War is that they've got to get rid of 25,000 military aircraft, a vast number. And so offering 100 to each of their four dominions was hardly going to put much of a dent in that stock of aircraft. And what happened to the vast majority of them is that a company was set up to actually dispose of these, and many of them then got sold into civilian use. One of the pioneers of British aviation, Sir Frederick Handley Page, turned it into a business, and these are the premises from which the aircraft disposal company then operated. And they sold complete airframes or spares into the market for years after this. There were, in fact, a small number that were bought and brought to South Africa and became the basis of some early civil aviation ventures, again operated by ex-Royal Flying Corps pilots of South African origin. And Alistair Miller was going to be one of those. The Solomon brothers operating in the Cape were going to be another example. But it just shows, of course, the scale of aircraft disposal. And so offering 100 aircraft to each dominion was perhaps not as generous as you might think. So Van Ryneveld was then appointed. His title was Director of Air Services, DAS, and that was dated 1st of February 1920, which of course is then taken as the birth date of the South African Air Force. Somewhat misleading in practical terms, in real terms, because it was going to be several years, or at least 2 years before the first aircraft were actually assembled and flown properly from a base outside Pretoria. But nevertheless, 1st of February is still to this day taken as being the birthday of South African Air Force, and normally there are parades held around that date, even today. Van Ryneveld, having put together the imperial gift for shipment to South Africa, to Cape Town, then set out to return to the country himself, but he was intending to return by air and be the first man, he hoped, together with his co-pilot, Quinton Brand, to fly from England to South Africa. There was, in fact, a competition with prize money for aircraft that accomplished the journey by air to the Cape. And Van Ryneveld and Brand were the South African entrance into that. The prize money was £10,000, a huge sum of money. The South African government bought a Vickers Vimy bomber, and that became the original Silver Queen. And that made it as far as Egypt, and they wrote it off in an accident quite close to the Nile River. The engines, the Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, were then pulled out and installed in a second Vickers Vimy, which made it as far as Bulawayo in what was then northern Rhodesia, Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, and taking off from Bulawayo in hot and high conditions, they managed to stall and crash Silver Queen 2. Just as well, the rules for this air race didn't specify how many aircraft you were allowed to use. So Smuts, who was determined that South Africans would win the race, then insisted that one of the Imperial gift aircraft that were being offloaded in Cape Town by that stage be assembled and flown up to Bulawayo, and then Van Ryneveld and Brand would continue the flight. And so DH9 was then assembled, flown up there. That became Voortrekker. And this is Voortrekker at Beaufort West on the way down to Cape Town to win the prize, to secure the prize and the credit for being the first two men to fly from England to the southern tip of Africa. And they were also, of course, going to be knighted for their achievement, split the prize money between them. And I think if you go and look at the Rolls-Royce, which is now in the car collection at Franschhoek, that Pierre van Ryneveld bought, I'm fairly sure that was part of what he bought using his prize money from this flight. So it involved 3 aircraft, but they nevertheless wrote a place for themselves in the history books by being the first to fly to the Cape. And that's them after they arrived, with letters, telegrams of congratulations for their achievement. And then Pierre van Ryneveld could, of course, take up his newly appointed position of Director of Air Services. In other words, the first head of a South African Air Force. By the way, Quinton Brand did not continue his career in South Africa. He returned to Britain, continued his career in the Royal Air Force, and of course was one of the commanders of a sector during the Battle of Britain in World War II. So, what did the so-called imperial gift consist of? There are a lot of fallacies about it. People often get obsessed with the 100 aircraft. Even that's not entirely true, because actually there were more than 100 aircraft that were given to South Africa. But the fact is that the imperial gift really constituted a ready-made air force. If you could find a base and if you could find personnel, you had an air force. Because it consisted not just of aircraft, but of hangars, the aircraft themselves, all the vehicles you would need, including those Hux starters. You see one starting in Avro there. Tons and tons of engine and airframe space for all the types they'd selected, full sets of tools, fuel, dope for the fabric, because they were all fabric-covered aircraft. Fabric itself, which was grade A cotton, cameras for aerial reconnaissance. And so all you really needed to add was a base and the personnel. But otherwise, it was a ready-made air force. So it wasn't confined purely to 100 aircraft. There was actually a heck of a lot more to it than that. So that made it quite a generous offer. So with the 100 aircraft plus some others that were donated, I'll tell you where those came from in a moment. What remained was, of course, to select an initial operating base. In fact, the first base that was created that is of huge importance in the story wasn't the famous Swartkop, which later became ZAS, Swartkop Air Station. But rather the place where all the spares were initially stored and collated and readied to provide aircraft assembly and technical support. The Swartkop came a little bit later, but there was actually a facility established quite close by. It would later become one air depot, one AD, which was actually the first SAF facility before Swartkop was then chosen close by as a piece of fairly level ground that could be used. So the place that I'm referring to that was actually the first facility was the aircraft and artillery depot at what was then known as Roberts Heights. Roberts Heights would undergo 2 name changes, as I think you know, later becoming Voortrekker Hoogte, and then later on becoming Thaba Tshwane. But the original Roberts Heights was the largest military base in South Africa at the time. And all of what you see shown in that top left photo was the aircraft and artillery depot. And it was the main facility where all the airframes, engines, and so on were going to be assembled. From there, they were taken to Swartkop and then obviously operated from that air station. And you get some indication of the sort of number of spare engines and so forth that were brought to South Africa as part of the imperial gift. In terms of specific aircraft types, Van Ryneveld chose 48 DH-9 aircraft, destined to be actually the most useful of the aircraft which he chose. Under the wings, and then also suitable for aerial photography. They chose 30 Avro 504K aircraft as the trainers for this new Air Force. And then imagining that they were going to have a sort of a fighter squadron, which didn't actually materialize in the original Air Force, they also took 22 SE-5A aircraft, arguably one of the best British fighter aircraft of World War One, and one which had been flown by quite a large number of South Africans. So those were the three aircraft types that actually made up the official imperial gift. And the idea was that between those three aircraft types, you could train pilots, you could cooperate with the army, you'd have a light bombing wing, and you'd also have potentially a fighter squadron, or maybe even two, mixed in with the original Air Force. It didn't turn out that way. What tends to be forgotten is that beyond the imperial gift, there were actually some other aircraft donated. There were 10 DH-4 aircraft, very similar apart from the engine to the DH-9s. And those were donated by the Overseas Club of London, who bought them as military service aircraft and then passed them on to South Africa. And those then went on strength with the South African Air Force. And then there was also a single further DH-9 donated by the city of Birmingham. And for a time, that was actually painted on the side of that particular DH-9, as you can actually see in this photograph. So those were additional aircraft. And then also what tends to be forgotten is that Alistair Miller's two recruiting aircraft, of which he only used one, but those ended up in Cape Town, and those were actually the very first aircraft that Britain gave to South Africa. So technically, the very first aircraft that came on strength for the South African Air Force were these BE-2E aircraft. This one is a beautiful replica. You may or may not know that the New Zealand film director, Peter Jackson, has spent millions of dollars on his passion for World War I aircraft. And he actually has a company at Masterton, and they turn out these perfect replicas with engines that are exact copies and so forth. And they've made replicas for quite a few museums around the world, as well as others that fly in New Zealand. This one is in Britain. It'd be wonderful if some South African billionaire could sponsor a few of these replicas so that we could plug a few holes in the gaps in South Africa's aviation heritage. But I digress. This technically then became the first aircraft type handed over to the South African Air Force before the rest of the imperial gift arrived. However, I can find no evidence that the South African Air Force ever operated this. And the best I can figure out is that one of these was actually sold to the government meteorologist to use in his duties in terms of weather forecasting and so on. And it does seem to have flown in the Pretoria, Johannesburg area for a short while, but not by the South African Air Force, although it was technically the first aircraft on strength. So those two aircraft were also part of SAF strength. They appear in a couple of photos, but don't seem to have been given Air Force numbers, and probably ended up, as I said, at least one of them probably ended up in civilian hands, operated by a private owner on the reef for a short while. So the founding officer corps of the South African Air Force in 1922 were these 18 men, and they were, all of them without exception, were all ex-Royal Flying Corps or ex-Royal Air Force, with one of them having started his career pre-World War I with the South African Aviation Corps, and the rest having been trained in Britain and then having served during the First World War. So they came basically out of the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Air Force service and tradition, and became the founding members of the South African Air Force's officer corps and pilot contingent. So a very, really tiny Air Force. Van Reinfeldt had plans and hopes for a much bigger Air Force because of the number of aircraft that he accepted. But the reality was that budgets quickly put a hold on his big ambitions. And all you really had was flights of aircraft devoted to training, bombing, and initially some fighters. But the idea that you were going to have entire squadrons of aircraft was not going to be true, really, until you get to the 1930s. Sadly, the first action that the South African Air Force took part in was policing an action after the declaration of martial law on the Witwatersrand, pretty much the entire Witwatersrand, Central Rand, East Rand, West Rand, when a miners' strike turned violent in 1922. Initially a dispute between the miners and the Chamber of Mines and the mine owners, but it quite quickly erupted into violence and martial law was declared. And Smuts then deployed not just the police, but the army. And Van Reinfeldt, of course, he was champing at the bit to prove that his new Air Force was useful. Really, if you look at the correspondence and the telegrams that flew backwards and forwards, it was Van Reinfeldt who pushed for the Air Force to become involved in the action. And so aircraft were actually being assembled as quickly as they could at Swartkorp. They were still in their Royal Air Force markings. They were hastily bombed up. They were hastily armed with Lewis guns and sent off on an almost daily basis on either reconnaissance missions or bombing runs against towns on the Witwatersrand. Sadly, the action of the South African Air Force in 1922 was going to be probably the most controversial aspect of the government's handling of the 1922 strike. Not just because of the psychological aspect of dropping bombs on civilian targets, even though the miners themselves were armed. They even came up with one of their own anti-aircraft guns. But because during some of the bombing raids, including the one that's shown here on the East Rand against the Benoni Trades Hall, bombs landed in houses and killed civilians not directly associated with the strike action. And that was going to cause a huge amount of bitterness and definitely became the single most controversial aspect of the Air Force's first action. By the way, it was a first in another respect, and that was that the South African Air Force took its first casualty in 1922. One of the observers in the rear seat of a DH-9 was actually killed by ground fire from the strikers, and he was the adjutant of the Air Force, Captain Carey Thomas, who was actually a 26th Squadron RFC veteran, who then died flying on a sortie over Johannesburg. Yeah, there you have your first SAF fatality. That was Captain Carey Thomas. And another first is that you have the first use of aerial photography. And this remarkable aerial photo actually survives from one of those sorties. This was photographing the army and the police advancing on Fordsburg Square. If you look carefully right over to the extreme left of the photo, you can actually see the barricades of the strikers at the top of the street, and you can just make out some of the trenches that they dug in Fordsburg Square, right on the top left corner of that photo. And they were dug in the pattern of trenches on the Western Front in the First World War, because many of those strikers would have served there. You can also, among the vehicles advancing up the road was a Whippet tank, which was a one of the first 2 tanks brought into South Africa. It still survives. It's actually at the Staff College at Tabachwani now. And that also was used as part of this assault on Fordsburg Square. When I was studying at Wits, we were taken on a walking tour of Fordsburg Square. So I'm talking 1983, 84, around about there. And there were still bullet holes in one of the urinals of the public toilets from a strafing raid of a SAF aircraft from 1922. It was amazing that that relic was still there at that stage. Just some other firsts, also sad ones. The first aerial fatality, I think you probably know, was it was an Avro 504, which crashed while stunting. It was actually structural failure, and it crashed into the apple orchard at Irene Farm, the famous Van der Bijl farm. And one of the 2 casualties in that crash, who was the pilot, was actually one of the Van der Bijl family. That is actually commemorated today on part of the Irene dairy farm, although you can't actually make out any of the apple trees at this stage, so the orchard unfortunately has disappeared. So as I said, the idea of having full squadrons with specialized roles didn't materialize because of budget constraints. And so the Air Force actually shrunk during the course of the 1920s. And it was a very tough task to actually keep it viable. But Van Ryneveld had the amazing idea of contracting out work, because the South African Air Force was the only organization, the only maintenance organization that could actually repair and maintain aircraft, any aircraft. Any work done for civilians, for example, trans-African pilots, local flying clubs, all of that sort of thing. Any work that was done was charged at a certain rate, and the money went into a fund, which was called the Aircraft Replacement Fund. And that gave him a kitty from which he could draw to either extend the life of the original Imperial gift aircraft, or modify them and upgrade them so that they didn't become obsolescent. The most useful of the aircraft that featured in the early South African Air Force was very definitely the DH-9. If you look at most of the early operations, there was a punitive expedition that went up to Southwest Africa, which South Africa was running by that stage as a League of Nations mandate. Those were DH-9s that were sent up. The 1922 strike involved only DH-9s. And later on, when you get the first really a proof of concept airmail experiment being flown around the coast, and the idea was really just to pick up the mail from the mail ships in Cape Town and then fly it down the coast ahead of other forms of transport. And the Air Force proved that the concept was viable and ran it quite successfully for a number of months. There were some accidents during the course of this, but they proved that it could be done. And in fact, the very first airmail stamps were produced for that service, which was being operated by the South African Air Force. And again, the aircraft used were all DH-9s. Interesting, this was the first SAF roundel. South Africa was in the throes of trying to agree on a flag, a national flag. And before the adoption of the flag based on the Dutch East India Company flag, or the House of Orange flag, or the blue, white, and orange, there was talk of these colors being used in the South African flag, and that seems to have been the reason why the Air Force adopted them until 27. I did mention the Aircraft Replacement Fund earlier. It was very much Van Ryneveld saying we need to find a source of income in order to upgrade aircraft. And so a number of aircraft upgrades, some of which were unique to South Africa, were then undertaken. The Avro 504K was modified to a 504N standard by fitting a radial engine, a more powerful radial engine. That was an approved British modification. But things like the Impala, okay, we were there. All right, almost done. So there were, in fact, some unique South African hybrids that were created that allowed these airframes to be used right into the 1930s and kept them useful and kept the Air Force affordable up until the 30s. So if you've been following all those various threads, and don't get too concerned if you haven't, but this is an attempt to try and just show the sort of family tree of the South African Air Force in terms of things that fed into it. So you've got the South African Aviation Corps top left. You've got Alistair Miller recruiting for the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force. You've got the South African Aviation Corps becoming 26th Squadron Royal Flying Corps. And all of those were going to contribute personnel to the initial South African Air Force. If you're trying to find the thread that runs from the SAAC through to the South African Air Force, in other words, from 1913 through to 1920, that thread is a very thin one, because in fact there's only one person whose service started with the SAAC and then continued through World War I, through the Royal Flying Corps, and then into the South African Air Force. And that is Kenny van der Spy, who later became a lieutenant general in the SAF. He's the only one that you can trace right through from pre-World War I, through the war, and then to the founding of the SAF in 1920. However, the vast majority of the other pilots were either Miller boys or...
Back, John.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know if it's my connection. Yeah, in terms of relics, there's not a lot left. There are two Imperial Gift aircraft that survive, preserved in the Military Museum in Johannesburg. There's DH-9 and there's an SE-5A. The SE-5A is not shown as a South African Air Force aircraft. It's been restored in the markings of Andrew Beauchamp Proctor, who was the top scoring South African ace in the First World War. But then one mustn't forget that Air Force Base Swartkop, which has recently been renamed, I don't know, Mobile Air something or other, sadly, that they've lost that link to Air Force Base Swartkop. But most of the hangars from the Imperial Gift still survive. One did burn down about 3 years ago, but the rest are still there and mainly house the South African Air Force Museum. I don't know why this is not budging. Oh, okay, there we go. Just to preempt one question, which I'm sure somebody was likely to ask, and that is the South African Air Force the second oldest Air Force in the world? It's become a very sort of oft-repeated idea that it is. The short answer is that it isn't, sadly. It's the second oldest British Commonwealth Air Force. In other words, after Britain, after the Royal Air Force, within the original British Commonwealth nations, it was the second Air Force that came into being. So we beat the Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and so on. In that regard, they only had Air Forces that came into being later in the 1920s. The Finnish Air Force dates to March 1918. The Royal Air Force officially April, and Poland comes into being in 1919, and the SAF then February 1920. So it isn't sadly the second oldest, but it is the second oldest within the Commonwealth. And when the SAF celebrated its 50th anniversary, I think that's when a lot of people started to drop the reference to the British Commonwealth and simply refer to it as the second oldest Air Force in the whole world. But that's, strictly speaking, not the case. Okay, so any questions beyond that one?